Welcome to this week's PermaPuheet. Our teacher today is Aranya. Aranya is a long-time permaculture educator in the UK, and you probably know him best for his book, Permaculture Design, which I highly recommend. It's one of the earliest books I got my hands on about permaculture design, and it's a classic. So yes, if you don't have it, buy it. I met you during their tutor training with the UK Permaculture Association, and you mentioned that you were writing on a book about deep permaculture. And I was like, whoa, Aranya is writing a new book. That will be exciting. So when I compiled the PermaPuheet, I was like, I have to ask Aranya. I have to ask if he will be part of it. So I'm very happy today to have you. So please welcome Aranya today. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you, Dominic. Yes, another book. I mean, my first book was quite small and deliberately small. The idea being that it was something you could put in a pocket or a bag and take around with you, go to your site, do your designing. This one is sort of everything that's not in that book, that's also really not in other books about permaculture. So this book is called the same as the title. Shall I share my screen? Share screen. Here we go. That's the one, isn't it? There. Okay, and I need to obviously make that full screen. There we are. Does that work? Do you see that all right?
Looks good. Yes.
Good. Okay, good. Yeah, so it's called Deep Permaculture. It's got a slightly longer strap line than this, but essentially it started off as a book about pattern, form, the shapes of things, inspired by an article in Permaculture Activist many years ago. And I was, completely gripped by the idea that nature solves problems with shapes. And so I thought that's a good subject for a book. And I started writing it before the one that you're familiar with. But the person who was sort of coaching me at the time, who was a student on one of my PDCs, said, which one will be more popular? And of course, at the time, I realized that, okay, it was the other book. So this one sort of got put on hold for a while. But over the years, and it's been the best part of 20 years now, it's acquired other subjects. So it started off about just patterns in nature and the functional nature of patterns in nature, and then started to acquire things like systems thinking, because you can't look at patterns without thinking about systems and so on. So this is the idea of this, really, is that it's deep permaculture in the sense that if you go to a permaculture site, somewhere that's been permacultured, like my friend's place, Our Organics, that's 25 years this year in Dorset, and you walk around and there'll be a lot of things that are familiar, like fruit trees and it's a polytunnel, and she's got a sort of nice wooden building. And then there's the occasional thing that's unfamiliar. So if you're there when she's irrigating in the evening, she floods the garden so she collects water. It's previously a water meadow. The landscape has been created in a way that there's a stream, and the stream can fill a pond, and then the pond can be emptied down to irrigate the land. And so you might go there and say, that's the permaculture. But what the problem with permaculture is that it's different in different places. And so you can't just see permaculture, because permaculture is about how we put things together and understand where we are in the context and so on. So this book and this slideshow really is just a little introduction to the vast number of things that I cover in the book, but in relation to the things that are familiar, like the principles of permaculture, for instance. So we have some here. There's David Holmgren's principles, very familiar to many of us, and yet they're encapsulated in a little phrase with a little proverb, and yet the book that he wrote about it was quite a big book. Here we are, this one. I'm sure you're probably quite familiar with that. And each chapter, there's 12 chapters in here, is quite long, because there's much more going on beneath the surface of these. But there's And inevitably, we need to simplify in order to get ideas across. And one of the challenges for us as permaculturists is having simplified it to not miss a whole bunch of things that are going on there underneath the surface. So this book really is about delving deeper. And so if you're looking at your site, you're starting to notice immediately things, but then things connect together into systems, and there's all kinds of stuff going on beneath the surface which we understand in permaculture when we put a system together, but it's not always obvious to the person that goes to see it. So this is about unearthing, revealing all the things going on beneath the surface. So at its essence, permaculture involves learning to read systems and applying successful patterns that we've learned at the most appropriate scale for whatever it is we're trying to design for. Now, we live in a world of objects or a world of processes? And of course, as permaculturists, if we spend time observing, then we quite quickly realize that we live in a world of processes. But if we see the world as a collection of objects, it's a bit like seeing one frame of a movie like this one. You may even know this movie. It's it's very good and quite confusing movie. But what can you tell from this? You need to see all of the frames of the movie to get the story, and we need to spend a lot of time observing a site to understand what's going on. So another book that I highly recommend, which was recommended to me a good few years ago, is Seeing Nature by Paul Craffle. There we are. I don't know if I pronounced his name right. And one of the things he says in his book, it's a beautiful book. He says, I sit, and as my mind quietly explores the view, a rigid world of objects merges into a flowing world of change. And that's just, for me, just epitomizes the challenge we have, because in a world where everything, we're all busy, we glance at something and say, oh, yes, I know this, I've seen some trees there, and we don't see everything that's going on around that. So this is the same laptop that I'm talking to you, communicating you through. And yes, so here we have my standing desk, my very makeshift standing desk. Didn't cost me anything. Well, apart from buying the books, of course, but I already had those. They were bought for another reason, to read them. So there's a table. Originally it was a tree or some trees, as was the books. And someday they'll all be soil again. But for me, hopefully, if I look after them, then I only get to know them as books and a table. And so, but it's just a snapshot of a process of things moving through different forms, which is what nature does. So processes are fed by flows, particularly climatic flows like the sun and the wind and the rain and so on. But they vary. So if we look at what nature does, nature builds resilience, and permaculture is about putting resilience back into our systems. Nature builds resilience by seeking out new flows when flows diminish. Migration, for instance. There's not enough food there, so some creatures migrate. Others will build up stocks, like a bear putting on weight for the winter, or a squirrel needs to be agile, so it can't put on too much weight, so it just buries its excess stocks outside. Or of course, beavers making dams to raise the water to create a nice safe place for their lodge, but also to acquire more vegetation because they're vegetarians. And to remember that life moves as well. It's not something that we have really. We talk about accelerating succession or natural succession, but life moves, and that's something that we humans have stopped doing, and then we're just trying to stop everything else moving. So a lovely example. So obviously large herds of herbivores, you won't really be standing where the cameraman is there, because you probably get trampled. I'm assuming that's on a long lens. On the left here is some raspberries that we planted on a bank behind a fence, and now you can't see the fence because the raspberries have moved. The raspberries want to move because the trees behind them, in a natural environment, they would be ahead of trees trying to stay in the light, and they move to stay in the light. So if we don't let our raspberries move, or our strawberries, because well, you know, they also want to move. Bramble also wants to move, blackberries. If we don't let them move, then the plants die off, because that's their natural behavior, is to move, and the other plants that would be in the shade normally, they die off. So, and yes, life cooperates. I think we understand that one, and I've got quite a few examples of this in the book, all the different forms of cooperation, but I won't get into that today. There's just one lovely example on the left hand side, a couple of horses I came across once standing end to end, and they were using each other's tails to waft away the flies from each other's faces. It's just such a beautiful thing to see. And on the right here, there's what we might call a fairy ring in Britain. It's a fungi growing out from a central point in a radial form. And you can see where the fungi are underneath the grass is much lusher, because it's obviously in relationship with the fungi, mycorrhizal fungi. And if we look at what's on the cover of the Permaculture Designer's Manual, it's absolutely laden with all kinds of interesting, flows of the sun, the rain, and light, light. And then we've got pattern, we've got cycles, and all kinds of things going on in there. So there's a lot of symbolism in there. So if we move on to some very basic systems stuff, and this can be a bit confusing sometimes, so I won't get too much into the detail of how this works, but essentially we've got different kinds of feedback that we see in nature. So things like balancing feedback, which is represented by the bee at the top there. So the populations of prey and predator, for instance, like rabbits and foxes. So if the population of rabbits goes up, then there's more food for foxes, so the fox population goes up. But if there's more foxes, then more foxes eat more rabbits, so the population of rabbits goes down. And we have this balancing where the populations are going up and down in turn, with delays in between, but essentially they keep each other in balance, and that's a natural process. And we have another kind of feedback is reinforcing feedback, where we have the tree, say a tree, but we see this relationship throughout nature at all kinds of scales, from lichens right up to, yes, forests. So a healthy tree with a mycorrhizal fungal partner, they are feeding each other, and that reinforcing feedback means that they both get healthier. Of course, there's always a limit, there's always some balance to this. The tree can't grow forever. At some point it's limited by something else, like temperature, or the length of the season, or the specific the properties of water that mean they can't grow any higher than they can, and so on. So, but we have these things, and in permaculture we can use them. So if we're trying to repair a system which is being damaged by reinforcing feedback, then we can either increase balancing loops, or we can try and reduce the strength of those reinforcing loops. So here's an example of a detrimental reinforcing feedback loop, because the other two were beneficial. And again, I'm not going to get into this. This is in my other book anyway, but just this one thing leads to the next. Essentially causal loops are this causes that causes that, but it comes around on itself, and it either spirals out or it stays in balance depending on what's going on. And then we have tipping points. They get talked about. We often talk about climate tipping points and the temperature. If we get to a certain temperature, then we get runaway climate change. But we can also relate this to populations and the importance of keeping enough individuals in a population. So one of the things we often see in systems, again, is population time graphs, that kind of thing. So if a colony has enough within it, so just using the example that we saw on film many years ago, the penguins in the blizzard, and they're circling around trying to stay warm, and of course the ones on the outside are pushing in because they're cold, they have more desire to get to the middle, and the ones in the middle are quite comfortable, and then they suddenly find themselves on the outside. So there's this whole dynamic going on all the time. But the more penguins you have, the less time each penguin has to be on the outside, and so the less risk there is of each individual penguin dying. So when you have one penguin, it's always exposed and it's highly likely to die in a difficult conditions. When you've got 7 penguins, this is the sort of almost the flower of life thing, isn't it? 6 around 1. Then each one is more than half exposed 86% of the time, approximately. And then as we keep adding more penguins, each individual gets exposed for less time. So there's a point at which if a population drops below a certain level, then they're more likely to then die out. So we see large groups of penguins and not small ones, because small ones don't survive. And that's represented here by the time graph. And if you could have a healthy population, but then some kind of critical event that kills off quite a lot of them suddenly, could then lead to the demise of all of the penguins. So one of the questions we ask in permaculture is, how resilient are we individually? And of course, if you're able to step outside your door and you've got power that you're generating on site and you've got food outside your door, you're going to have much more resilience than if you're just twiddling a thing on your wall that adjusts everything and the energy is coming from somewhere else and we're not in control of it. And often a lot of the stocks of things like water, for instance, are coming from some distance away. So we have no control over that. We're not in control of the delivery of that. We might think, I'm the one turning on the switch or the tap, but there are switches and taps a long way away from us. And if they get turned on, turned off, then nothing we do is going to make any difference. So in permaculture, we want to design for those vulnerabilities. Where are we most vulnerable? For most of us, that's water, energy, food, of course, perhaps shelter. And of course, these large stocks can also cause havoc. So dams can flood, break, causing flooding and so on. And so in permaculture, we're also thinking about leaks and looking at limiting factors. So that's often a good way of designing in some interventions quite early on. So we design in resilience, but we use a systemic approach where we're looking at where we are as a whole system rather than a bunch of individual things. And of course, those things are also processes. And we also want to understand the context of where we are, because it's one reason why permaculture looks different in so many places, is that the environment, if the environment is different, then the limiting factors are different, the resources we have are different. So it's important for us to understand the context. And I had this lesson taught to me quite nicely when I bought this bicycle 15 years or so ago. And it's a recumbent, but the seat's quite high. It's not one of the recumbents. Obviously, you can see where you're right on the ground. This was a cargo bike. And for me, I was quite excited about getting one of these. And it'd been a long time since I bought a new bike. And so I went and I bought this bike and I brought it home and I started riding it around, and I was having problems with it. And then it dawned on me one day that this is a bike that was designed in the Netherlands, which is quite flat. And I bought it in Bridgewater in Somerset, and then on the Somerset levels, which is quite flat. And then I brought it back to Dorset, which is like this. And pedaling one of these uphill is really difficult because you can't use your weight because your feet are pushing forwards and not down. And so all I was doing was pushing my back into the seat, and it was really uncomfortable. So I ended up selling it to somebody who lived in a city, which was a bit flatter. The context, very important. The bike was designed for flat landscapes, but it wasn't advertised as such. I had to figure that out for myself. So when we're doing designs, one of the first things we do, of course, is to try and understand where we are. And we already observe flows and stocks. So when we talk about systems, we tend to talk about stock and flow structures and things. So flows, we give them different names. So sectors are incoming flows of the wind and the sun and the rain and maybe sound and those kind of things. Microclimates are temporary stocks of cold air or warm air or moisture. So we call them different names, but they're all flows and stocks, and we can think about them in that way, and that can help us. So desire lines, so people moving around the site, it's all about flow and where people stay. hang out their stocks of time, people in time. We've also got zoning, which is also related to that. And of course, water, most obviously, water flows and can be accumulated in stocks, either in areas that flood or when we capture that water and hold it deliberately and so on. And we have collecting surfaces on roofs and so on. And if we think about the things that we look at when we're doing design, we can think about them all in relation to flows and stocks. So animals move around the site, but they tend to stay in one place. A squirrel will bury a cache of nuts, for instance. Plants gradually move across the site, so we could have stocks of trees, everything that we might consider to be a thing, we can also perceive as a stock. Now, in systems books like this one, which I do recommend, it's a very good book. I don't know if you can see that, Thinking in Systems by Fenella Meadows. It was put together after she died. You'll commonly see the stock and flow diagram, and it tends to look like this. You have a cloud on the left, which is where things come from, and a cloud on the right, which is where they go to, and you have your stock in the middle, which can be all kinds of things. Logs in a log basket, food in your fridge, water in a water butt, and things going into the stock. So food is coming into the fridge, going out of the fridge. Logs are coming into the log basket, out of the log basket. And very often these flows are controlled as well. So the tap represents the control on the inflow and the outflow. So a bath obviously has taps that control the water going into the bath, which is the stock of water in the bath, and the plug that controls the outflow from the bath, like that. But it's a very simplified version of reality. And if we ask the question, how does the flow get into the stock? And that gets us into some interesting questions, because of course in nature that's very much a natural process. We have gravity, things fall under gravity, but also the difference in temperature on the Earth's surface creates wind that brings things across the surface. And when, of course, water falls onto the surface, it runs across the surface or percolates down into the soil. We have all these stocks of water or ice, and ice high up in the landscape is an important stock because that melts slowly. So it holds that water and releases it gradually. So communities that rely on glacial meltwater, they don't need there to be rain all the time or precipitation all the time because it's releasing it slowly. And of course, as the temperature goes up and glaciers melt more quickly, then that creates more of a problem because the stocks are eroding, if you like, over time. But again, we've got lots of flowing and stocking going on here. So there's a lot of different elements within this kind of system. So you have your flow. So let's call that rain, for instance. And then you have a collector. So in nature, that's the landscape. Water falls onto the landscape, is collected by the land. But of course, we also have buildings. So rain falls onto a roof. That's also a collector. And then your focuser, which in the landscape is usually the land, the shape of the land. So ridges shed water into the valleys. For us, that might be some guttering that focuses the water off wide, comes down the roof, focused into a pipe. Processor, which in nature is probably the soil, doing some filtration and so on. But in our system, that might be some kind of filter that collects, filters the water before it goes into your water butt. In nature, that's the soil, or eventually the oceans. And of course, a water tank is also going to have a tap, and your distribution might be a literal irrigation system, or it might be a water butt or something, watering can or something. So each of these processes have, the different functions as part of this whole system of water collection or whatever it is. And just to briefly look at this, to say that all of these things have properties. So flows have location, direction, velocity, quantity, quality. Quality can be to do, it could be that it's warm or it's cold or it's clean or it's dirty. Quality can take many forms, the variability of flows and so on. And some of these things are not so easy to change, but some are. So collectors have location. So if that's the roof of your house, that's where it is. Orientation is the aspect of that, or the direction of a hill, the aspect of a hill. Surface area, again with the roof, you can't really change that too much. Depth relates, doesn't always necessarily relate to a roof, but to a landscape that might be to do with the depth of the soil. The efficiency, how easily water flows off, which of course in a landscape you don't want water to flow off very much. We need some runoff, but we also don't want flooding. Whereas a roof, you do want the water to be shed. So this coefficient, this runoff coefficient, you want to be low in a in a landscape, but quite high on a roof. And then we have focus on distributors. Let's just go through these quickly. Containers have particular properties, stocks have properties, processes. Processes are about connecting things together that don't currently match up. We'll get into some detail about that, but it can do things like cleaning water to make things last longer and so on, or to pre-digest things. And then we have controls which manage the stock levels by slowing or stopping flows, but they can also be leaky. So all of these things, all of these properties are things that we can change. So by way of an example here, we've got at Organics, a very nice system. So water is collected on the roof of the building. You can see it's in a single-story building into a container. And that water then, in fact, there's two containers. So the lower arrow points to a hot water tank behind the one in the front that you can see that's raised up. And then that cold water tank is topping up water from the system as it's drawn off. So there's a second collector at the bottom that's collecting the sun's energy to heat the water. That's being traveling through. So from the hot water tank, the cold water in the hot tank, that makes sense, sinks, heats up in the panel, and that warm water, because of thermosiphoning, rises up and goes back into the tank. So gradually that process takes the heat out of the panel and stores it in that hot water tank, which is topped up by the cold water tank, and then you can draw that off. And all of those things, how there's the tanks are a certain size, certain efficiency, and you can improve the efficiency of things like the collector by insulating it, for instance, or changing the volume of the tank, and so on and so forth. So there are many things that can be tweaked, and some things cost money and other things are completely free. And we're often told, say with the solar panel system, if your batteries run out, normally someone will come along and say, oh, you need more batteries or you need more solar panels. But it may just be that your solar panels need moving or cleaning or reorientating. But we tend to be told, do the thing that drives the economy and costs you money. So here we can take this idea and apply it to things like the digestive system, so relating that to our health and thinking about, if we have bad digestion, is it because things are not being some of these controls? Just don't have time to get into all of these different things, but these symbols on the left hand side represent so the one at the top there where it says hand, that's a collector. Sight and smell are controls, because they stop us putting things in our mouth that are not going to be good for us, for instance. Taste is also a control. If doesn't taste good, we tend to not consume it. And then we've got chewing to break down, mixing with saliva, mixing, and so on. And each of these things have a delay on them, that optimum delay that's the result of human evolution. That things take a certain amount of time, and of course our modern context has shifted us out of alignment with that. So one interesting delay is that our ancestors, when they started to feel hungry, they would then have to go and get that food. They couldn't just open a fridge and eat it. So we tend to feel hungry 3 or 4 hours before we actually need food. And in the modern world, that's a bit of a disaster, because we eat way more than we need to, because we're responding to that same signal that had a delay that's evolved for our previous living conditions, and now it's completely out of alignment with where we are in the modern world. So how are we doing for time? Okay, it's good, this, isn't it? So if we're looking at these and we say, where can these kind of systems go wrong? Well, there's all kinds of things that we can tweak. So whether we're looking at a collector as a solar panel or a roof, some things we can't change. We can't change the orientation of a roof or its location, but we might be able to do that for a solar panel. We might be able to clean that up and make it more efficient. Flow can be contaminated. There can be leakiness. There can be inefficiency in sort of little swirly sort of a process. The location might not be very good. We might be able to move it, or there might be erosion from overflow, leakiness of taps, all these kind of things. There's many places that we can look at in these kind of systems to help us improve things rather than just going out and buying more stuff. And just want to touch on this briefly. In Danella's book, she also has the 12 leverage points for intervening in a system, and they're very interesting, and I get into them in the book. I just want to mention them here because they make a big difference. And interestingly, low down, so close to the pivot at the bottom there, she has stocks and flows and buffer sizes, because if we don't get those right, so buffers and stocks and flows, this is all about the sizes of tanks and the pipes and all those kind of things. You know, when you dig a pond, how big is the pond? If we don't get those things right at the beginning, they're really difficult to change. And that's why she sees them as not very powerful interventions. And that's why it's important for us to design things well and do them right, which is why we spend a lot of time observing, trying to understand where we are. And yeah, systems are complex. So there was concerns when pine martins were being reintroduced into Scotland and the north of England, that they would reduce populations of red squirrels even more, that had basically been out competed by grey squirrels for about 150 years here. So the populations of the red squirrel, which is native to Britain, they live now in relatively small pockets and they're struggling, and there was concern about that. And then what actually happened was that because the grey squirrels are bigger, then the pine martins find them easier to catch. So red squirrels can escape them very easily because they've evolved with them for a very long time. But the grey squirrels come in from the North America, and so they get caught much more than the reds. So the reds are actually benefiting from the presence of their predator, because the predator is eating their main competitors. So systems can be surprising, and that's why we tend to make small changes. So Bill Mollison said, allow the system to demonstrate its own evolution. And that's an interesting letting go. But in terms of how systems work, it's certainly a useful approach. So the principles, what are the principles all about? Well, there's lots of different versions of the principles. We already looked at Holmgren's earlier, and there's many different. So this is Colleen Stevenson's version, which is also very nice and varied. But one of the things that we do see within principles is this balance between efficiency and resilience. So nature does both of these things well. And this is just a sort of an overlapping Venn diagram where a group from a PDC has said which ones are about efficiency, which ones about resilience. And there's a lot of overlap in the middle there. And in our modern society, we tend to focus on efficiency, but not so much resilience. And that's the dangerous thing to do. So if we think about so one of the Holmgren principles, catch and store energy. This is about making stocks. And if we're looking at, okay, so one of the things here is the drivers of the flows. So for many of us, many of the things that come to us powered by fossil fuels. So whether it's a water pump pumping water or electricity and so on, they arrive because they're being powered by these non-renewable drivers, whereas nature delivers things using the laws of physics, like gravity and convection and so on. So, and if we can add a stock, because essentially when water arrives out of the sky, it's the same, it's come from the same place as the water company, only they've stored it some distance away, usually high up in the landscape in large bodies of water, and then use power in some ways to deliver that. So to collect these things on site, if rain's falling out of the sky where you live, then it's a no-brainer really to be collecting some of that rather than having to use the energy and rely upon somebody delivering it to you through a pipe. So what else in terms of resilience? Well, working with nature, because nature is resilient. So if, and that takes different forms, as I say, the laws of physics. If we work with the laws of physics, we know that's going to work. Gravity is unlikely to ever switch off, and if it does, we might have a moment of I can fly before, oh my god. And then and working with biological resources, of course, because nature is made of things that are infinitely recyclable, and we know that's a really good idea because nature's been doing it for a very long time. And in terms of efficiency, also nature uses shape to solve problems. Material is expensive because if you're a living thing like we are, it takes energy to go and collect stuff to make yourself with or other stuff. But the shape you make it in to a greater degree is up to you. And so nature uses shape to solve problems. Form follows function, forms follow functions. And that's also about efficiency. And also using local resources and expertise, of course. So when we collect leaves or material for compost, or on the right hand side here, wood chip that was produced just down the lane, these are things that are local, but also the expertise of the life in the soil that's breaking these down and turning them into compost, which then feeds the plants and so on. So the expertise in terms of local expertise, it's organisms that are able to do things that we can't do, like the plants can photosynthesize. Many of the organisms in the soil will break down that harder material. So particularly fungi, saprotrophic fungi, can take wood, lignin in wood, and break that down, which is again, it's one of those skills that plants can't do it, we can't do it. And so it's making those connections with the organisms that can. Appropriate scale is also about efficiency. So things need to be big enough to meet our needs. So, but for fruit trees, if we let them be their full size, for many of us, we don't have room for them. So, but it's more efficient for us to grow our own food, particularly when we're looking at things that are full of water, like fruit and vegetables, because water is heavy. And if we're moving it around with fossil fuels, then that's a bit crazy. That adds to the footprint of those things. So it's more efficient, as well as, growing our food on site, but also to grow things full of water is much more efficient to do as close as possible to home. And also the efficiency of nature from the fact that every element performs many functions or multiple functions for each element. And of course, nature, when we're working with nature, that's very easy to do. So here we are planting a hedge, but the hedge is also going to be providing food and habitat and so on. So resilience. Resilience. How to get into this one? Okay, I think I might skip that diagram for now. It's in the Resilience Thinking book. Here we are. It's that one. Sorry, resilience. Yes, Resilience Thinking. If you can see that one. There we go. By Walker and Salt, which is also another very good book. That's all about case studies of how people are working with ecosystems that are having problems and why they're difficult to repair, but also how we can do that. So, but how do we make our systems more resilient? Well, functional redundancy. So one particular principle that we talk about is each important function is performed by many elements. So in the food garden, it's obviously there's lots of different food plants we might grow, and in a given season, some things will do well and some things will not. But we also need to think about when we're looking at flows, also we want to be meeting our needs with more than one flow. So it's not just about things, it's also about flows. And we want to balance diversity with redundancy. We talk a lot about having diversity in our permaculture gardens, and that's very important because that diversity creates beneficial connections and strong ecosystems. But at the same time, if we only have one of this and one of that and one of that, and that dies, then we lose that service. And there's, yes, of course, when something disappears from your system, it frees up the opportunity for something else to come in and provide that, but also you lose the services of that thing. So in a guild, for instance, if you've got a plant covering the ground or fixing nitrogen and it dies, then you lose that service, you lose that function in your system. So ideally, we have more than one nitrogen fixer and more than one ground cover, more than one pollinator attractor, and that's giving us redundancy within that. And of course, they don't all have to be around the same trees, because when we're thinking about things like guilds, we also want to be thinking about how far away does this need to be nearby. So, for instance, if you're trying to protect the roots of your fruit tree from being eaten by rodents, for instance, which is something that we have to do here, then we might surround the tree with the bulbs of something they don't like the smell of, like daffodils or some alliums, and that will repel them from around the roots of the tree. So that will need to be around the tree. But if something's attracting pollinators or pest predators, they might not need to be right under the tree. It could be 10 meters away and still be doing the job. So yes, so when we talk about diversity, there's different kinds of diversity. There's ecological diversity, not going to go there today. Species diversity, which is what we tend to think of as different species, but we also have response diversity. So we have, this is all about how different things respond to different changes. So given that we're entering a time of climate change and we don't really know what the future is going to hold, we might have long, wet, gloomy summers, or we might get long, hot summers, or we might have mild winters. And so what we're wanting to do is to make sure that we have things in our gardens that will thrive regardless of what happens. So for instance, on the right here, we've got a persimmon tree that likes hot summers to ripen, or we might not get that, but if we do, this will do really well. And then we have other things like pears, for instance, in the garden, which will do well if we have wetter periods and so on. So, and also when we're looking sort of, this little diagram here is about fruiting times for pollination groups. If you're living in a reasonably mild landscape, then you could have overlapping pollinating groups anywhere here. But essentially what this does is, because some flowers, some apples, pears will flower earlier than others, it does mean that at some point in the spring, if we have a bad period, we're still going to get fruit somewhere, rather than if everything flowered at once. It means that they would have to, pollinators would have a harder time and they wouldn't have nectar for a very long period of time. But also, if the weather was bad there, then we would really have a lack of pollination. We wouldn't get very much fruit. So this is also about response diversity, but we see that in terms of the pollinating groups of these fruit trees. Then we have redundancy, modularity, and connectivity. So this is thinking about how much do we want to put things together and how much do we need to keep them apart. So this bunch of grapes, which was growing outside our back door, illustrates it very well. So the wasps come along in the summer months and they can tell which are the ones that are ready. So they'll puncture a hole in the skin and start to drink it out, and spores get into the grape, perhaps off the wasp themselves, and will consume the grape. But because of this, we call modularity, is that the grapes are individual and not one big grape. That means that some of these can get spored and rot, whereas most of the grapes will still be fine. And of course, for the grapevine, it wants to attract things to come and eat the grapes that will take the seeds away, which the wasps are not going to do. So that's important for the vine. With our water tanks, so we've got 2 water tanks here. If one tank gets a problem with it, then the other tank, we still have that backup. It's the we're splitting our water stock across multiple tanks, which means that if there is a problem in one place, then it's not going to necessarily be in the other. Like if you were to put a whole bunch of, if you put all your fruit in one box and then there was a problem with one fruit, then you'd lose everything potentially. Whereas if we start dividing things up, then we have a greater chance of still having something as a problem with one of the stocks. And then also how we put things together. So this is at the bottom here is just about how water tanks can be connected. And if you're watching this on the recording, you can pause and just have a look at that. And then the permaculture chicken, again, is all about how we connect things together. And of course, the chicken being a mobile thing, you've just got to give it access to what it might need and it will go find it. Whereas if we're assembling a system like a water harvesting system, then we're in control of putting things together and we have to connect them well. Now, if we're thinking about optimizing flow, stocks and controls, very often, so here we have a couple of examples. So thermal mass in a building, that's the one at the bottom here. Sun comes in the window, goes into the thermal mass, and uncontrolled, then some of that heat can go into the ground, but we actually want it to be radiated back into the space. So we put insulation in order to control where the heat goes. So it goes into the thermal mass. We can't stop it coming out, but we can stop it going in certain directions. And that's the same with the design of the clay oven above. Normally it just comes through the clay and radiates into the space, whereas this means that we can keep more of that heat in and make use of that, cook more things or use less wood. And yeah, on the right hand side, strawberries that we sliced and dehydrated. Doesn't look very much, but because each one is very, very strong, you don't eat many at once. So if we have too many of those, they just sort of sit around by the time the next strawberry crop comes around. Of course, when you've got fresh strawberries, you don't eat these. It's a little bit also like thinking about carrots in a fridge when they start getting bendy. And, I've been through that phase of, oh, I'll eat the bendy one today so I can eat the fresh one tomorrow. But then the fresh one tomorrow is tomorrow it's bendy as well. So stocks can be too big. So we need stocks to be the right size so that we're eating things fresh. And that might be counterintuitive on some level, but it makes more sense. All right, next one. So this idea of maximizing the storages, which Bill Mollison talks about, I would say in most situations we need to increase the storages, but maximizing often means you've got more work, more investment, you need to spend more money maintaining things and time. That's not necessarily good. But if your water is running out, then you definitely need more water stocks. And often it's not so much about the flow, it's just that we need a bigger glass. So for instance, in the greenhouse, they often get super hot and we ventilate them because there's not enough thermal mass to soak up that heat during the day and then give it back at night. And this is the idea behind the forest garden greenhouse or sort of bioshelter system, is that we're storing that heat for later. On the right hand side, you want a big drink, you need a bigger glass. It's the equivalent of thermal mass. And we want to build stocks at different scales as well. So grow food at home where you've got access to it, but also support local growers, because we also need local food to do well. This is thinking about different scales, different holons. Now, safety elements, also another important thing to think about. So when you've got your system, we're working with gravity. So gravity is a really great and useful tool. And there's an example here. So this is a place I went to teach in Malta. Pepe, who was living there at the time, and you can see he's on slope. And in Malta in the summer months, 6 months of the year, no rain. And so he has to collect rain over the winter months, and it does rain quite a bit in the winter, to then irrigate the land during the summer. And so he, in his system, he lives halfway down the hill in a cave, and he's got these water tanks built in. But what he was doing was gravity irrigating down the hill, and one of his neighbours had somebody to come and help, and they opened the tap to irrigate the garden at night, and it's the irrigation system has all these fine little drip lines everywhere, and it's all mulched. It's very well organised, but they left it on overnight, and they lost about 60,000 litres of water overnight. That's the equivalent of about 2 or 3 months of irrigation water just gone overnight. Because of course gravity is great, it's a gift, but also brings a great risk of loss, because if you open the tap, it's just going to all come out. So one of the things that Pepe put into the system was that he put a small tank at the top of the hill, just up near where this photograph was taken, a little 1,000 litre tank. And during the day, he would use the energy of the sun, which of course there's plenty of that in Malta, just to pump 1,000 litres of water up to this tank at the top of the hill, and then he gravity irrigated only from that tank. So there was no gravity tap out of that big tank where all the water was. It could only come out of that top tank. And even if that was left on and it all emptied, that was about the amount of water he used anyway. So he's added some complexity, but it's made safer his main stock of water. He actually had 2 big tanks. But so this idea of simplicity versus complexity, we can make things cleverer, more complex, but when we do, we add more things to go wrong in a system. So it's that balance between making sure that the system is safe, which was, so Pepe's added a little bit extra to his system to make sure that he's got safety in there. But so this is our compost toilet at home. So the shed on the right hand side, you can see as we're putting the pipe in, so the water is being collected off the roof behind us, which is the conservatory, into these tanks, and then that's gravity fed across the garden to the shed. If you look to the top left picture where you can see the toilet, and on the right hand side of that picture there's a sink, and the sink is fed by a foot pump, so you can't leave that tap on. The water only flows when you pump it with your feet. And then the water goes through that, goes out of the bottom of that sink, around the back, and bottom left picture, it runs down through under the urinal. So it has a separator, urinal separator, and that water from the sink flushes through there and basically takes some of that away. And then the water comes back out. So on the right hand side again, that comes by gravity again, just runs down the hedge and feeds the plants in the hedge. And then the vent in the system, the vent pump, if you like, is just wind driven. So there's no electricity involved in this. It's just simply, you can see it just about on the back of the shed there. It's showed closer up in the bottom there. So that's just driven by the wind. And when it gets hot, it's black, heats up, you get rising warm air. So it's a simple system with very little to go wrong. And then in terms of processing elements, so processing elements are about putting things together that might not necessarily match. So you've got your rainwater diverter with a filter in there. That's just means that water, stock of water, should keep for longer. On the left hand side, this is a homemade water cooling system. So this comes out of somebody's sink, this communal sink at Land Matters, goes through a grease trap. This is the washing up water, comes out of those pipes there, goes through, that collects all the bits, and then it sits in this tank of stones, gravel, for a little while where it cools down, and then when the next flush of water comes through, it displaces that, and then it goes on to the bit where the plants are. So it stops the hot water getting to the plants. So this is just a very simple gravity-fed cooling system, but it allows the hot water to go to the plants without being hot by the time it gets there. And then in terms of thinking about edge, this is my friend Pat's garden. You see, gravity irrigated from the pond in the summer months, and the ducks go in, because as soon as the ducks see the water, of course ducks love water, but as soon as they see the water in the garden, they know that slugs are coming up out of the soil because the water is flooding under the beds. The slugs come up early because they don't want to be underwater, and the ducks go in. So the ducks see the water, they know there's going to be slugs, and they go in. Now, It's a very basic diagram. I've got, I'm hoping somebody will draw this better for me, but this is one quick sketch that I put in my book. And of course, I've noticed that the gates are closed, but the idea here is that putting things together. So we're familiar with design lines, zoning and so on, and thinking about how do we put things together to create useful flows. So here we're looking at how do we get ducks interested in going through the vegetable garden? Well, the one way we can do that is to put their home where they live, sleep overnight, on the opposite side of the vegetable garden from the pond, so that their direct line through is through the garden in the morning. So you open the gates up, they go through, they eat some slugs, and the same on the way home in the evening, to come back, eat some slugs. Now, if you're also wanting the vegetable garden to be irrigated by the pond, from time to time, then that wants to be uphill, vegetable garden downhill. And of course, if you've also got a house, that pond could reflect low winter light into the house. So then we're starting to put these different things together to work with these flows of people and energy and so on, in order to make that work as best as possible with the least inputs. And it's also good to think about, where do people already travel? So this is somewhere where people park their car, and you can see it's mown, that's a path through to a house. We can put a whole load of things along this zone 1 pathway in order to get people to interact with them. So that could be fruit and salad and that kind of thing, where people would see, what's going on and they interact. Now, how are we? What's your thoughts, Dominic, in terms of time? I'm clearly running over. How would you, what's your...
No worries, just keep going.
Keep going, okay. I'm happy to keep going. So yes, so stacking something we're very familiar with, of course. And again, this is about making use of the space that we have around us. There's a very lovely diagram here by Katie Shepherd, who's done one of the talks earlier on in this series. And my very crappy version down at the bottom here, which again is going to be improved for the book. But this idea of, yes, making use of different heights and levels, and how do we put these things stacking in space and time? Again, it's familiar, but it's also about relationships, putting things together. And then also accelerating succession. So we often talk about this, but what's not always very clear is that as the species we see above the ground changes, as we go through this process of succession, the soil also, the life in the soil also changes, the balance of life in the soil. And this is really nicely described with this diagram here. I don't know fodderfarm.co.nz, New Zealand, but it's a very nice diagram. And this relationship between fungal and bacterial action in the soil and how that changes. So when we're looking at the plants we grow and what they need, they like to be at different places on this successional cycle. So it's thinking about, what do we need? So if we're growing veggies, then that's generally sort of a 1-to-1 fungal to bacterial ratio in the soil, which is not the same as what we commonly see on farms, which is just plow the land to death, and there's no life in it. And we're trying to grow things over here on the left, when really mostly they want to be in the middle. That's the same for grains as well. They want to be in the middle. So how can we accelerate that process to create the conditions for the things that we're trying to grow? And then delays, thinking about delays in systems. Of course, where we're planting a tree, a fruit tree, then what I tend to do in terms of thinking about guilds, so supporting plants for trees, and of course it's not just about plants, could include chickens and such as well. But when I plant a new fruit tree, small fruit tree, the only thing I tend to put in with it is an allium which has been inoculated with a mycorrhizal fungal partner, because I'm trying to just help the tree to establish, and I will mulch around it very well to stop the grass competing. But most of the things that a tree might have in a guild, it won't need immediately. It doesn't need pollinators immediately, because I want to grow this tree and get it to grow into a good shape before it starts making fruit, because fruit takes away from the growing process, and it won't need pollinators. It might not need pest control for the fruit if I'm not growing the fruit yet. So there's a whole bunch of different things that it doesn't necessarily need to have with it or nearby immediately anyway. On the left-hand side here, I've included a photo of some sweet peas. Many years ago, I was going off to teach a course, and I stepped outside the back garden, and there were sweet peas growing up the wall, and I noticed they were covered in aphids, and I thought, oh, I'll just enjoy them, because when I get back, they'll all be dead. And I came back, and they were still perfectly happy, and there were no aphids. And we had ladybirds that would live in the house over winter. And obviously, if I was to intervene at that point, say I've got to kill the aphids, then there would be no feed for the ladybirds. So it's acknowledging that things happen. Balance is not about being in a balanced place. A balance is about a shift from one place to the next. But there's a dynamic nature to that, and the aphids will appear, and then the ladybirds will turn up, and it's appreciating that those delays in the system. So if we're thinking about how do we integrate systems, there's several factors here to think about when we put things together. And so the first one is supporting functions. If we're doing something, so growing food might be our primary function. So to increase our food security because we import too much of it from somewhere else. But to grow food, we might need to support that in some way. So for instance, there's a tank here, water tank, which is covered in a fantastic cultivar blackberry called Sylvanberry, which I highly recommend. It's very spiky, it's very vigorous, and the fruit is delicious. It crops in July here in Britain, which is earlier than any other blackberries I know. Yeah, it's spiny, but it's really worth it. And it's great for growing over things. So we've grown it over the water tank to protect the tank from the sun. We'll get to that in a minute. But water obviously is supports the growth of food. On the right-hand side, we have bat boxes in Martin Crawford's forest garden. This is all about supporting pest control. So if you're growing apples, you might need some predators like bats to munch on some of the moths to protect the tree. So it's about putting habitat in place, and Martin also has a big pond which attracts flying insects to bring the bats in. And so it's how do we support what we're trying to do by using other systems. And then we have secondary benefits. So these are the things that are bonuses, if you like, when we put things together. So on the left-hand side at Nikki and Graham Elliott's place, they've got a peach tree growing on the south-facing wall, and because peach is vulnerable to peach leaf curl, they're in the east of England, so they get less rain than we do in Cornwall. But what they've done is they put a solar panel above the peach tree, and it acts like a roof. So it's a solar panel, but it's also a roof, and it sheds the water away, and it stops the peach getting peach leaf curl, which is really problematic. So that's a lovely little integration. And of course, over here where we used to live, we grew grapevine over a pergola, and the pergola provides, the vine provides summer shade when the sun is high, but it's hot, but then the leaves come off in the winter. So the vines are providing fruit, but they're also providing a secondary benefit of summer shade. And then, yes, how do we put things together to create energy cycling? And of course, that's one of the things that we're most familiar with within permaculture. But we can also think beyond our boundaries. So if you look at this little stop and flow diagram at the bottom, so my friend Pat, she grows a lot of veg, and she would every couple of years she gets manure from the local organic farm, and she also sells to customers. She has customers, and in terms of the boundary of her site, the manure comes from somewhere else, and then the customers take away the food. But we can look at, so we're only in control of that bit in the middle, but if we start having discussions with the farmer about what they're doing and where the manure is coming from, we can start to get some control over that potentially, and that as an input to our site. And also it's unlikely that the customers are going to come back and poo out the food that they bought from you, but we might be able to change their habits as well as a process of, because of this relationship we have with them around veg beds, so that the compost might not just go in the bin, it might actually get composted in the gardens. And so we can have an influence beyond our boundary, which is perhaps not obvious. And we can also thinking about how we optimize. And I suppose, again, I'm just going to not talk through this, but I'll say the best place to intervene here, we can make interventions at all kinds of levels, but a really important thing is to think about the end user. So we're quite happy to go and buy a new A++ washing machine because it's more efficient to have less demand on the system if we have a more efficient end user. And of course, for many of the things for us, we are the end user. So if we can improve the efficiency of the receiver, which might be about just trying to make sure that what we eat, we digest well, or in our actions in terms of what we do with waste materials, then we can, so utilizing those waste, cycling them back to grow more food and that kind of thing. So what I tend to do is to try and look at the end. So what's the end user? And if we can reduce the demand on the system, then we don't need to grow so much food. Our modern food system is just so wasteful. We grow huge amounts of food and so much of it just disappears before it gets to us. For all kinds of reasons. So again, it's about improving the efficiency, but we can target specific spots. And then the last one really here in terms of integration is thinking about dependencies. And as perhaps the most famous thing within permaculture to do with the dependency is the scale of permanence, Yeoman's scale of permanence, which is related to keyline. And another one of Katie Shepherd's lovely diagrams here. Now, this is interesting because Yeoman's he made his money in mining as an Australian guy, made his money in mining, had loads of machines, bought farms, because that's what you buy land. And he decided that he could use mining machinery on the farms and shape the land to, hold water and that kind of thing. And his whole approach was he would get land and then he would say, what's the most permanent thing? Well, the climate, we can't change that very much. And it's going to rain, but that's, the delivery of water is a certain time. But he realized that if he could shape the land, and the landscape provides opportunities to make little dams to collect water. And then those dams determine where the roads go, because the roads go over the dams, the roads become part of the water collecting and delivery system. And so then he had this whole process of, we put the water in, and then the roads, and then the trees, I think, and buildings were actually quite a long way down his list because he didn't have buildings already. He used all of these he put all these other systems in, and they said, okay, having put all these other systems, where's the best place for the buildings? Whereas for us, most of us have a building and we're not going to move it because it's a big, heavy thing. And so the scale of permanence is useful, but for many of us, we need to rearrange it to make more sense for us in terms of what's permanent for us. And just looking over here on the right hand side, this is our persimmon tree again, I think slightly earlier. But one of the things to say about here in terms of microclimate, so on within the scale of permanence, you have microclimates somewhere in the middle and then soil at the bottom. And we're very concerned about soil loss. But one of the things Yeoman's realized was that we can build soil quite quickly relative if you do things well. And this is very much the case here. So microclimates are difficult to change. If you've got a big building, you can't move the building. The sun is in a particular direction. This here on the right hand side is the best microclimate on our site. It's sheltered, it gets sun, and it's also got no soil at all because the barn was built on bedrock and there's no soil there. But it's easier for us to make a sort of a box out of slabs and fill it with soil and grow a tree there than it is to improve the microclimate where we do have soil, because that's much windier. Does that make sense? So that we're thinking about that scale of permanence in terms of how do we put things together. And just a couple of other things to mention. You're probably quite familiar with this idea of forms of wealth, the 8 forms of capital and so on. When we're thinking about flows and stocks, it's worth thinking about, if we talk about capital is just a stock. The stocks run out, so if you head to the hill with ammo and beans, one day your ammo and your beans is going to run out, and then what do? So it's really important. Real wealth comes from flow. And of course, us learning about growing food and foraging and all of those things is about connecting with those flows. So if we look at these things, and I've made a slightly different version of those, so hopefully that's going around, that each of these is a stock and it's also a flow. and some of them are quite stable. So our social, cultural, intellectual stocks are quite stable. They don't change very much. Physical health and techno-industrial things, yeah, they can decrease gradually over time, but that's generally a slow change. Generally, our financial stocks are the ones that go up and down, most volatile, and we tend to stocks make us feel safe. Logs in your log shed or food in your larder or your garden, it makes us feel safe. And so when we focus on stocks, the stock of money, for instance, then we often feel quite stressed about that. Our well-being is connected to the stocks we focus on. And so if we're focused on what we know and the people we know and the friends we have and the connection to nature and the culture, and we value those things and we focus on those and we feel gratitude for those, then we feel we're much more emotionally stable, because we're not connecting ourselves to that volatile thing time. Yeah, and there's so much more, but I've run out of time ages ago, I think. So I'm going to stop there, because that's the end of that. Do I stop sharing screen?
Oh yes, please stop sharing.
Although I'm not even sure I can pause the share. Stop share. Oh, there we go.
Nice.
Hurrah!
Amazing. This was like a permaculture, an introduction to permaculture condensed in 1.25 hours. It was
It's
like
impossible, isn't
whoa, yeah, it is. Wow, very, very inspiring. Thank you very much for it.
That's all right. It's probably a good job that there's not many people left, or not many people here to ask questions, because I've used up quite a lot of the time. Yes. Introduction to Permaculture and Systems Theory in 1. Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to do with the book, is to, you can still see me all right, can't you? I feel like the background's got a bit darker. These are great books on systems thinking, but they are very much about systems, just general systems. They're examples of electricity supplies and how many cars in the car sales room, and how when do you have to order to accommodate the delays and all of this stuff. So they're interesting, but they don't really focus on what we were focused on, which is interesting, because Delilah Meadows was a systems ecologist, and she was involved in writing Limits to Growth and so on. So, but yeah, I suppose it's picking common things that people are familiar with or thinking about at the moment, maybe not so much in the future. So
yes, and if I thank you very much, it was very, very interesting and very fascinating.
Great.
And it looks like exactly like it's having been reading Donnella's book, and it's a scientific book, no, it's a theoretical book, but it seems we always need the bridge from science and theory into practical examples that people can use and get inspired, and because permaculture sometimes, even though it's so hands-on, it can be very sometimes I feel we've lost our imagination a little bit. So it's helpful to see these examples.
Yes, good. Yeah, for me, it's just to be able to look at a system and analyze it, and not just be influenced by the common, because we know that the world around us is all about selling stuff, isn't it? So, it's selling more products, and we're all encouraged now to buy solar panels and such, and things that we don't. Well, we know we buy stuff that we don't need. I mean, it's the whole point of capitalists, just sell us more stuff that we don't need. But there are things that can make us a bit more self-reliant, and it can feel like if I have more solar panels and more batteries, then maybe I'll feel safer. But for me, the stocks, having stocks of things, having seeds is really important. But at the same time, I think the real wealth comes from having the knowledge and the experience of what to do with those seeds and how to multiply them and how to share them and find other people who also know how to do that, so we can support each other and grow things for each other. And when you're saving seed, it's really difficult, because of all the fantastic different varieties that we have now, is to grow more than 1 or 2 varieties of something. because then apart from all the work that you have to do, you've got the risk of cross-pollination. And so it's much easier if somebody over there does that one and you do this, and then we always end up with loads of seeds. You know, you grow pumpkins and squashes and loads of seeds, or lettuces, loads of seed. So then there's lots to share, and of course that creates connection with other people of like mind. And for me, one of the most important things about permaculture is meeting other people of like mind and learning from them and sharing things. And that stock, the stock of what we have, is also a distributed stock, you know, to have that stock, the resilience of having community around us, of people that we can learn from each other, learn skills, but also share resources. You know, on one occasion I made a garden which was almost entirely, I had very little money, almost entirely plants that were given to me. And then I grew things, and then I gave other plants to other people. And then my garden, when I moved out 5 years later, got bulldozed before I had a chance to go and rescue anything. But then other people then gave me plants back. You know, we had a veechberry here, which is one of those plants again that is a blackberry hybrid. It wants to do this. And we grew it, but we didn't put it in a very good place. We've learned a lot about where we are in terms of how things grow, and good locations for them. And we needed to layer it, and so I layered it a few times and gave them to other people. And then the one we had died, and now I'm thinking, who did I give that to? So I want to get that one back. So I know it's out there. I've got some ideas of who I might have given that to. But it's just it's lovely to know, because it was quite a difficult thing to get in the first place. So sometimes, you know, we could just go and buy it, but it's not always possible to go and buy things if they're unusual. So I like making cuttings, giving them to other people, and then knowing that that's spreading out there. But yes, yeah, systems. It's a fascinating, completely fascinating thing. I love it. And yes, I hope that, I know not everyone's going to be excited about it as I am, but I feel that there's a lot of fascinating things going on here. And I just feel like, well, you know, if I can tell you, you decide whether you're interested or not. But if you are, then you're really pleased probably to hear about it. And then we can start having conversations, and then I learn from you and that kind of thing. So yes.
Lots of benefits come from one book. One object has so many.
Yes.
um,
So many connections. I mean, just the fact, yes, this book, because I was having conversations. So this was a chap called Steph, who lives in London, who I haven't really seen for ages, but I used to see a lot around the Permaculture Association, and we had conversations about things. And he sent me this book. He said, you must read this book, and it was perfect. And that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had that conversation. And now I'm recommending it to other people. Say, yeah, get this book. It's fantastic, really lovely. So yeah. And of course, that just means on one level, oh, there's more stuff to go in my book. But I'm also what I try to do with my books is to not get into the stuff that other people have already done. There's no point in me writing about social design, because people like Luby have been doing that for ages. But nobody's really talked about how to use our permaculture observation skills and deduction from nature to work out how this body works, you know, the actual physical body, and what our ancestors had to do, because the form follows function. So, you know, things like, and just putting things together. So there's a guy I came across a little while ago, I think he's called something like knees over toes guy, and he does a lot of walking backwards, and often with a weight. So he's dragging this kind of heavy sled backwards, and you can walk backwards up a hill, a similar thing. And you're obviously using very different muscles from when you walk forwards. And in my brain, I was thinking, okay, so this is good, because for him, he's doing crazy things. I don't know what age he is, he's younger than me, but he's sort of leaping and putting basketballs in and just going, this is, you know, makes your knees really strong. by doing this. And I was thinking, well, people didn't walk backwards. I mean, it's a really crazy thing because you can't see what's coming, can you? But then when I started thinking about, okay, so if we're arboreal, we climbed a tree, but then you watch things coming down a tree, they come down backwards. And that's just like walking backwards. You're using the same muscles coming down a tree. And if you've gone up a tree, you've got to come down the tree. And so when our ancestors were more arboreal, which is probably quite a long time ago, but we know that people that climb are good climbers. You know, humans can climb very well, but there was a need for those muscles, and the body is developed around that, the need, you know, to do that, and the body is being shaped by that process. So there's a logic to why walking backwards is good for us, and it's something we don't do anymore. We don't climb down trees anymore. If we come downstairs, we come down forwards, not backwards, for obvious safety reasons. But it's our modern world has shapes our bodies. It's like you know, we walk on flat. So many people walk on flat surfaces all the time. You know, we learn to walk on flat surfaces. You just flatten everything because it suits the wheel. You know, we live in the countryside, and I've always loved running off road as well. But most people don't work all the muscles in their legs, their balancing muscles. So yeah, it's kind of interesting because, of course, flat surfaces are easy to walk on, and you can see why you can travel quickly across a flat surface. But it's only working part of our body, and then that imbalance creates all kinds of other problems, which just spills out in all kinds of directions with our health. So yeah, so I've written a chapter about that as well, because partly it was for me just learning trying to figure it out for myself, because I've always been interested in being healthy, but you know, how does that work, and what did our ancestors do, and how is that meant to work? And so there's a bit about that. But yeah, mostly it's about what does nature do, and where do the principles come from, and examples of systems thinking, and how do we rebuild resilience, all the different factors about rebuilding resilience, and then how that relates to, you know, the questions to ask around design, and how do you fix, you know, what are the questions if you've got a system, a function chain, stop and flow structure of, you know, collecting water or electricity, what are the testing questions to ask, you know, how resilient is the flow, and what happens if this element gets overloaded, or can I scale this system up or scale it down, and so on. So yeah, I love it. And I'm hoping it's a lot of people are going to find it useful as well. So it won't have all the usual stuff that permaculture books have in. It's going to be rather different again.
Looking forward to it.
Good.
So the obvious question would be now, when will it be out?
Well, that's, yeah. I reckon I'm about 90% finished. So I'm hoping, you know, I'm focused at the moment on getting the book finished. But it's kind of difficult to say, because it's, you know, I have everything in the book, but some of it's just messy notes and lots of duplications and organize. So I'm in that phase where I'm just having to organize what's there and sort of throw that doesn't make sense anymore, and that's been duplicated, and this is I'm putting it in an order that makes sense, which can be quite time consuming. My partner Jules, she does all of the grammatical stuff, so she'll look at it and say, I think you could reword that like this and it makes more sense, which is great. But I think, yeah, and there's a time scale of about 6 months from giving it to Permanent Publications, because they need to lay the book out. So this time, previously I did all the layout and everything, but this time I'm quite happy to just hand it over. I did it once, that's enough. So it's going to take them about 6 months to lay the book out, gather all the photos. You know, I've got photos and things. Some of the diagrams, as you can see in the slideshow, some of the diagrams are very scrappy, just rough diagrams. And this is the kind of thing that will be in here, either to have somebody to do that better, or to, you know, my diagrams are okay if I give them time. But it may be that we find somebody who can do it better. So we'll see. And the main question for me is what's on the cover, because there's so much. What image or collection of images will represent all of that? I don't know. So that's the biggest question for me, is not what else goes in the book, because I think the content is done, but what's it going to look like? So,
Yes, sounds like lots of decisions still to be made.
yes. So probably by the end, the end of the year at the earliest, I would say, but that would be nice. It would be really nice to have the book by the end of the year, but I've got to finish it first. Yeah.
Yes. Any questions? Lily, Lumia? Okay.
I'm fine. That was very, I think very clear and very good examples, and I can't think of anything to ask right now.
Okay, that's
Okay.
good. I'm aware there was a lot in there.
It's good we have the recording as for a bit of reviewing.
Oh yes. Well, Dominic always makes that available, so that's fine. Yeah. But yes, you won't be able to ask questions the second time around, but that's all right. There will be a book eventually. Yeah, it was fun putting this together because I haven't made a slideshow like this for about 4 years, and so I've had to sort of create it from scratch. And of course, the first time you do something, a new slideshow, then you realize quite how much time it takes.
Yeah, and you have to kind of remember how the software actually works.
Yes. And I was also, when I was going through the book, and what am I going to put in? And I thought resilience factors is an obvious thing, but there was so many things I thought, well, there's no room for that, and it still was too long. But maybe it's a series of different slideshows on different aspects of at some point. I'd be happy to come back in the future and do another one if you want. So,
well, yes, of course. You will always be welcome. Thank you very much for that.
Excellent.
Okay, I stopped the recording now.
Okay.